never forget that night. I was 18, babysitting for Sarah, a single mom trying to rebuild her life after a divorce. She had 2 kids, Emma, a sweet, curious 6-year-old, and Jake, a little ball of energy at just 2 years old. They were adorable, but you could tell they were carrying a weight no kids should ever have to. Emma asked questions that tore my heart apart, like, "Why doesn't Daddy live with us anymore?" Sarah had been through hell, but she was finally ready to move on. That Friday, she was heading out for her first date in years, and honestly, I was rooting for her. She deserved a fresh start. Before she left, she smiled nervously. "I'll be back before midnight, and the kids should stay asleep. If anything happens, there's a landline in the kitchen." Then, as casually as mentioning the weather, she added, "Oh, and if Daniel shows up, just don't open the door, okay?" My stomach tightened. I'd heard bits and pieces about Daniel, enough to know he was trouble. But Sarah assured me he hadn't been around in months. "It's just a precaution," she said, and with that, she was out the door. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. It was one of those older suburban homes, with creaky floors and dim lighting that made every shadow feel like it was watching you. After putting the kids to bed, I settled on the couch, flipping through the TV. Nothing good was on, just reruns and cheesy infomercials. I remember thinking how peaceful the night was. That didn't last. At first, it was just a soft knock at the door. My heart skipped, but I told myself it was probably a neighbor. I tiptoed to the peephole, but no one was there. Weird, but not terrifying. I went back to the couch, telling myself to relax. Then came the second knock, louder this time and accompanied by a voice. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Open up." The voice was rough, angry. My chest tightened as I peeked out the window. A man was pacing on the porch, his figure shadowed by the dim porch light. "Sarah," he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "I'm not leaving until you open this damn door." Emma's soft voice startled me. "Is that Daddy?" she whispered from the top of the stairs, clutching her stuffed bunny. Her face was pale and her wide eyes darted toward the door. I motioned for her to come down quietly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "Emma, go back upstairs and stay with Jake," I whispered. But she didn't move. The man on the porch started pounding on the door harder, rattling it in its frame. "Sarah, I'm done playing games. Open the damn door or I'll break it down." Emma whimpered, and I grabbed her hand, guiding her back to the kids' room as quickly and quietly as I could. Jake was still asleep, completely unaware of the chaos. I locked the door and pressed my ear against it, trying to make sense of the muffled shouting from downstairs. Then I heard the worst thing imaginable. "I've got a crowbar in my truck, and I swear I'll use it if you don't let me in." My stomach dropped. He wasn't bluffing. He sounded like a man ready to snap. I rushed to the window and peeked outside, hoping to see a neighbor or someone who could help. Nothing. Just the quiet suburban street, empty except for his truck parked haphazardly in the driveway. I reached for the landline Sarah had mentioned earlier, but my stomach sank when I realized it wasn't in the kids' room. It was downstairs. My hands were shaking as I tried to think. Maybe if I stayed quiet, he'd give up and leave? But as I strained to listen, I heard the crunch of gravel under heavy boots. He wasn't at the front door anymore. He was moving around the side of the house. "Shit," I whispered. He was heading for the back. I needed to act fast. I opened the window quietly and whispered to Emma, "We're going outside. Stay close to me, okay? And hold on to Jake." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she hugged her brother tight. We climbed out onto the sloped roof of the garage. The cold night air bit at my skin, and every creak of the shingles felt like a gunshot in the silence. I helped Emma down first, then lowered Jake into her arms. Finally, I dropped to the ground. But before we could move, I heard his voice again, closer this time. "You can run, but you can't hide. I'll find you." We ducked into the bushes, my heart racing as I tried to figure out our next move. The neighbor's house was a few yards away, but it felt like miles. I grabbed Emma's hand, whispering, "Stay quiet and follow me." We made it halfway across the yard when a flashlight beam swept over us. "There you are," he bellowed, the sound of his boots pounding against the ground as he started running toward us. I yanked Emma and Jake into the shadows, darting behind the neighbor's shed. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps as I held them close, praying he wouldn't find us. My hands were trembling so much I could barely hold on to Emma and Jake. The neighbor's yard was eerily quiet, except for the sound of his boots crunching the gravel as he got closer. His flashlight beam darted back and forth, cutting through the shadows. "Come out, Sarah. You think you can keep me from my kids?" he growled, his voice dripping with fury. "I'll make you regret this." I knew he wouldn't stop until he found us. Emma's little body shook against mine and Jake whimpered softly, his face buried in her chest. I placed a hand gently over his back to keep him calm, whispering, "Shh, it's okay." But it wasn't okay. Not even close. Then I spotted it, a small pile of rocks near the shed. I grabbed one, my breath hitching as I weighed it in my hand. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had to do something to buy us time. I hurled the rock as hard as I could toward the far side of the yard. It hit the fence with a loud clunk and the man's flashlight swung toward the sound. "There you are," he snarled, sprinting in the opposite direction. It worked. For now. "Emma," I whispered, gripping her shoulders. "We're gonna run to the neighbor's house, okay? Stay close to me and don't stop no matter what." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We bolted. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him stop dead in his tracks, realizing he'd been tricked. His flashlight spun back toward us, and I heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "Stop, or I'll shoot." I didn't stop. I couldn't. We reached the neighbor's porch and I banged on the door with all my strength. "Help, please help us." The porch light flicked on and the door flew open. Mr. Grayson, the old Marine who lived next door, stood there holding a shotgun. His face hardened as he took one look at me and the kids, then glanced toward the man barreling across the yard. "Get inside," he said firmly. I pushed Emma and Jake in ahead of me and collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Grayson stepped onto the porch, raising his shotgun. "That's far enough," he barked. The man froze, his flashlight illuminating his crazed expression. "Those are my kids," he shouted. "She's keeping them from me." "Drop the gun or I'll drop you," Grayson said, his voice cold and steady. The police arrived within minutes. Blue and red lights lit up the street as officers swarmed the yard. Daniel was still shouting, swearing he just wanted to see his kids, but his protests fell on deaf ears. They tackled him to the ground, his gun clattering to the pavement. Even as they hauled him away, he twisted his neck to glare at me. His voice was venomous, almost a whisper, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. "This isn't over." Back inside, I held Emma and Jake close while Grayson gave his statement to the police. My entire body was shaking, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on me. Sarah arrived not long after, her face pale as a sheet. She scooped up her kids, tears streaming down her face as she apologized over and over. "I should have told you more about him," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought we were safe. I didn't blame her. Who could have predicted it would go this far?" Weeks later, I found myself replaying that night in my head, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently. The answer was always no. I did what I had to do to protect those kids, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But Daniel's last words still haunt me. This isn't over. Sometimes late at night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window. Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe it's not. Let me tell you about the night that made me quit babysitting forever. It was 8 years ago in this little town just outside of Boston. Back then, I was a broke college student, scraping by on babysitting gigs. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most of the time, the kids were fine. Spoiled maybe, but manageable. Then there was Max. It started with a call late on a Tuesday. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson. Her voice was shaky, like she was in a hurry but trying to sound polite. She explained that she needed someone to watch her 9-year-old son that Friday night. She offered double my usual rate and even threw in money for dinner. I should have felt lucky, but something about her tone gave me a weird feeling. Still, I said yes. Friday night came, and I arrived at their house around 6 p.m. It was one of those old Victorian houses you see in movies. Big, dark, and just a little too quiet. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, smiling wide but with this nervous energy, like she'd been waiting for me all day. Her husband barely said a word, just nodded and glanced at his watch. "We'll be back by midnight," she said, handing me a list of instructions. "Max's dinner is in the fridge, his bedtime is 9, and whatever you do, don't open the basement door." I actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke, but her face didn't change. She just stared at me until I nodded. Then they introduced me to Max. He was small for his age, with pale skin and these dark, intense eyes that felt like they could see right through you. He didn't say a word, just glared at me before turning to his mom and saying, "I don't like her." Mrs. Henderson laughed nervously and gave him a little shove toward me. "Be nice, Max." He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He just stomped upstairs without another word. After they left, the house felt heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I called up to Max, asking if he wanted to play a game or watch a movie, but he didn't answer. Typical, I thought. Kids his age can be moody. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't relax. Every little creak in the old house made my skin crawl. Then, about an hour in, I heard footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought Max was finally coming down, but they didn't sound right. Too slow, too deliberate, like someone pacing. "Max?" I called out. Nothing. The pacing stopped, and I decided to check on him. As I climbed the stairs, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. His door was cracked open, and I could see him sitting on the floor, staring at something in his hands. "Hey, Max," I said, knocking lightly. "Everything okay?" He didn't look up. Instead, he mumbled something under his breath, too quiet for me to hear. "What was that?" I asked, stepping inside. He looked up at me then, and I swear his eyes looked darker, almost black. "Stay out of my room," he snapped, slamming the door in my face. I stood there, stunned. Then I heard him laughing, this high-pitched, creepy giggle that sent chills down my spine. I went back downstairs, trying to shake it off. He was just a kid, I told myself. A weird kid, sure, but still just a kid. I sat back on the couch, trying to focus on a show playing on the TV. But I couldn't stop thinking about Max. Something wasn't right with him, or this house. Then I heard a noise from the kitchen. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. When I got to the kitchen, Max was standing on a chair, reaching for the knife block on the counter. "Max, stop!" I shouted, rushing over. He turned to me, holding the biggest knife in the set, and smiled. Not a normal smile, a wide, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Why are you scared?" he asked, tilting his head like a curious animal. Before I could answer, he lunged at me. I screamed and dodged out of the way, running out of the kitchen and slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I leaned against the door, listening to the sound of him banging on the other side. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. I glanced around and saw the basement door was open. My stomach dropped. That door had been locked earlier. Against every ounce of common sense, I stepped closer and peered down the stairs. The air was freezing and the darkness seemed alive, like it was moving. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw something, a small figure hunched over, rocking back and forth. "Max?" I whispered. The figure stopped and slowly turned toward me. It wasn't Max. It was pale, with empty black eyes and a twisted, unnatural grin. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but the line cut off before I could say a word. The lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Then, from upstairs, I heard footsteps again. They were faster now, like someone or something was running. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the side table, clutching it like a weapon, and backed into the corner of the living room. My heart was racing, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. "Why are you hiding?" Max's voice called out, sing-song and mocking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The basement door creaked open behind me. Slowly I turned, and there it was, the creature from before, crawling up the stairs on all fours. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on broken strings. Behind it, Max stood at the top of the basement stairs, his face completely blank. "You should have stayed out of the basement," he said softly. The creature lunged at me and I swung the lamp as hard as I could. It hit the creature with a sickening crack, and it let out an ear-piercing scream before crumpling to the floor. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, and finally burst outside into the cold night air. The police didn't believe me, of course. They said the Hendersons didn't even have a kid. The house had been abandoned for years, but I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Max's voice in my dreams, calling my name. And when I wake up, the basement door in my apartment is open, just a crack. I never really babysat before, unless you count looking after my little brother now and then. But I've got a babysitting story for you. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. It all happened when I was 16, my junior year of high school. My parents had taken a last-minute weekend trip for some work event, and they needed someone to watch me and my younger brother Caleb. I was old enough to stay alone, but Caleb was only 9, and Mom didn't trust me to handle emergencies. They were panicked trying to find someone last minute, so when they finally found a sitter, they looked relieved. But I wasn't. I hated the idea of a stranger in the house. The sitter, Sarah, showed up that evening. She was in her early 20s, super pretty, and dressed casually, like she wasn't trying too hard. My parents seemed to love her right away. She charmed them in like 5 minutes flat. When they left, Mom told me, "Be nice, Emily," with that warning look she gives when she knows I'm annoyed. Sarah tried to make it sound fun, like a sleepover. She suggested we watch my favorite movie and even talked about ordering pizza. For a moment I thought maybe this won't be so bad. But things got weird fast. As soon as my parents left, Sarah switched. She wasn't mean, just off. Like when I told her my favorite pizza was pepperoni, she rolled her eyes and said she was vegetarian. I offered to split the order, half veggie, half pepperoni, but she ignored me and ordered a full veggie pizza. Caleb wasn't thrilled either, but I figured we'd just deal with it. Things got worse when someone knocked on the door. I thought it was the pizza guy, but nope, it was some dude. Sarah answered it like she knew him. He walked in like he owned the place. He was older, probably her boyfriend. They started laughing and whispering, totally ignoring Caleb and me. I remembered Mom's rules, no visitors. So I spoke up. "Hey Sarah, my mom said no one else could be here." She turned to me with this fake smile and said, "Relax, Em. He's just here for a minute." But he didn't leave. I tried to keep Caleb distracted upstairs, but we couldn't ignore the laughter coming from downstairs. Then it got quiet. Too quiet. That's when I heard a noise coming from the basement. I crept down the stairs, trying not to make a sound, and peeked into the living room. Sarah and her boyfriend were sitting on the couch whispering, but there was no sign of Max, our family dog. I called for him softly. "Max, here boy." Nothing. Then I heard a faint whine coming from the basement. My heart sank. I opened the door and tiptoed down. There he was, locked in a small closet, shaking. I was furious. Who does that to a dog? I let Max out and he followed me upstairs, wagging his tail like he hadn't just been through hell. I stormed into the living room, but before I could say anything, Sarah jumped up. "What are you doing sneaking around?" she snapped, her face totally different now, cold and sharp. "You locked Max in the basement," I shouted back. Her boyfriend stood up, towering over me. "Kid, why don't you mind your own business?" Sarah stepped between us. "Go to your room, Emily, now." "No," I said. "I'm calling my parents." She laughed, like I'd just told the funniest joke. "Good luck with that," she said, holding up the landline phone. I ran upstairs and grabbed my cell phone, but of course there was no signal. That's when I noticed Caleb wasn't in his room. Panicking, I searched the house. I found him in the kitchen with Sarah and her boyfriend. They were lighting candles and drawing weird symbols on the floor. Caleb looked terrified. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping into the room. Sarah smirked. "It's just a game, relax." But it didn't feel like a game. The symbols looked wrong, like something out of a horror movie. Caleb ran to me, clutching my arm. I want to go to bed," he whispered. "Take him upstairs," Sarah said, her voice calm but ice cold. "No," I said. "We're leaving." Her boyfriend blocked the door. "No one's going anywhere." I grabbed Caleb and bolted for the back door, but it was locked. Every door was locked. Sarah and her boyfriend were laughing now, their voices echoing in the dimly lit kitchen. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran upstairs with Caleb and locked us in the bathroom. Caleb was crying, and I was shaking, but I knew we couldn't stay there. I grabbed a plunger, my only weapon, and opened the door. The hallway was dark, but I could hear footsteps downstairs. I told Caleb to stay close as we crept toward my parents' room. That's where I remembered my dad kept an old baseball bat under the bed. I grabbed it and felt a tiny bit braver. We made our way back downstairs where Sarah and her boyfriend were now chanting. Max was lying in the middle of their circle, whimpering. "Get away from him," I shouted, swinging the bat. They both turned to me, their eyes pitch black. It wasn't just the shadows, they were completely black, like endless voids. Sarah lunged at me, but I swung the bat and hit her arm. She screamed, a sound that didn't even seem human, and stumbled backward. Her boyfriend tried to grab me, but Max jumped up and bit his leg. I didn't stop. I swung the bat again and again until they finally ran out the front door, disappearing into the night. When my parents got home, I told them everything. At first, they didn't believe me, until they saw the mess in the kitchen and the bruises on Max. They called the cops, but Sarah and her boyfriend were long gone. A few days later, we found out they were part of some creepy cult. Apparently, they'd been using babysitting jobs to get into people's homes. I still can't believe we survived that night. And even now, every time I hear a knock at the door, my stomach drops. Because you never know who you're really letting in. Babysitting wasn't exactly on my bucket list when I was 16, but my car needed gas and my parents weren't about to foot the bill. That's how I ended up in front of the Miller's house one chilly October night. It wasn't just a house. It was one of those sprawling Victorian mansions, the kind you see in horror movies. Ornate, creaky, and way too dark for comfort. Mrs. Miller greeted me at the door, flashing a polite but rushed smile. "Ben's 7, Liam's 10. They've already had dinner and they need to be in bed by 9. Max, our German shepherd, stays downstairs. He's protective, but he won't bother you." She left before I could ask any follow-up questions, leaving me alone with the boys and Max. The kids seemed sweet enough. Ben had that wide-eyed curiosity, while Liam acted like he was too cool to care about anything. Max was intense. He paced near the basement door, occasionally growling at nothing. As the night crept on, the house started showing its true colors. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes made my nerves tingle. But when Max stopped pacing and started barking, loud, aggressive barks directed at the basement, I felt the first real flicker of unease. "What's down there?" I asked, half joking. Ben shrugged. "Nothing. Just the monsters." Liam rolled his eyes. "There's no such thing as monsters, Ben. Stop being a baby." But Ben's face was pale, and he looked at me like he knew something I didn't. By 8:45, the boys were in their pajamas, and I was tucking them into bed. Ben refused to sleep alone and climbed into Liam's bed. "We need the candle," he said. "What candle?" Liam groaned, pulling a small, half-melted candle from under the bed. "This one. It keeps them away." "Who?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The monsters," Ben whispered, clutching Liam's arm. "If the light's on, they can't come." I stared at them, unsure whether to laugh or call their parents. Instead, I blew out the candle. "No open flames, guys. That's how fires start." They both looked at me like I'd just signed their death warrant, but I ignored it. "Good night," I said, closing the door behind me. By 9:30, the house was quiet. Max had stopped barking and the kids were asleep. I settled on the couch and flipped on the TV, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. Then I smelled it. Burning. Not faint, not distant, close. I bolted upstairs and found Ben hiding under Liam's blanket, his face streaked with tears. Smoke curled from under the bed. I yanked the mattress away and saw the candle had reignited, flames licking at the box spring. I grabbed a glass of water from the nightstand and threw it on the fire, but the flames didn't stop. They spread, faster than I thought possible, climbing up the walls like they were alive. And then I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A low guttural growl coming from the basement. I dragged the boys out of the room, my heart racing as the flames continued to spread. "Stay here," I told them, guiding them to the top of the stairs. Max was barking again, his deep, thunderous growls echoing through the house. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the fire extinguisher from under the sink, and sprinted back upstairs. The flames had reached the ceiling, blackening the edges of the room. I sprayed the extinguisher wildly, the white foam hissing and crackling as it hit the fire. Finally, the flames died down, leaving behind a smoldering mess. The smell of smoke hung thick in the air, but there was something else now too. Something sour and rotten, like meat left out for days. It wafted up from the basement, stronger than before. Max was at the top of the stairs, his ears pinned back and his teeth bared, growling at the closed basement door. "What's wrong with him?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, keeping my eyes on Max. "But we're not staying up here, come on." I grabbed their hands and led them downstairs, but as soon as we reached the living room, the lights flickered and went out. Total darkness swallowed the house. Ben screamed, clutching my arm, and I fumbled for the flashlight I'd seen in the kitchen drawer earlier. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, but it didn't feel like enough. The house seemed different now. The walls felt closer, the shadows heavier, and that smell, it was unbearable. I aimed the flashlight at the basement door. The wood looked warped, like it had been pushed from the other side. Max's barking turned frantic, and I heard it again, that growl. Louder this time, guttural and inhuman, coming from deep within the basement. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaky. "Now." "No," Liam shouted, pulling back. "If we go outside, they'll follow us." "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "Who's going to follow us?" Liam pointed toward the basement door. "Them." Before I could respond, a loud bang shook the house. I whipped the flashlight back to the door and saw the knob turning, slow and deliberate. Max went silent, backing away with his tail between his legs. The door creaked open an inch, revealing nothing but blackness. But in that blackness, two glowing eyes stared back at us. I froze, unable to look away. The eyes blinked once, then twice before a shadow began to take shape. Tall, thin, and moving unnaturally, like it was glitching in and out of existence. "Run!" I screamed, pushing the boys toward the kitchen. We stumbled through the dark, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I heard the basement door slam open behind us and the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. We burst out the back door into the cold night air. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. The boys clung to me, crying, while Max barked furiously at the house. "We need help," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need help now." The freezing night air was a slap to the face, but I wasn't thinking about the cold. My focus was on the house behind us. on whatever had just come out of the basement. Max stood between us and the back door, his barking relentless. His tail was low, his hackles raised, but he didn't run. He was ready to fight whatever was inside. "We can't stay here," I said, gripping the boy's hands. "We'll go to the neighbors." "They're not home," Liam said, shaking his head. "I saw them leave earlier." Panic started creeping in. My phone was still inside, and the landline wasn't working. The street was completely dark, every house swallowed in shadows, and that smell. It was outside now too, seeping into the air around us. Then I heard it. A soft scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. I turned the flashlight toward the house. The beam landed on the window of the boys' room, and my stomach dropped. Two glowing eyes stared down at us from the darkness, unblinking. They weren't human, too far apart, too bright, like twin embers burning in the black. The scraping got louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the house anymore. It was behind us. I whipped the flashlight around, the beam shaking as I scanned the yard. At first, I didn't see anything. Then the shadows shifted. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, tall, impossibly thin, with long arms that seemed to drag on the ground. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and blank, like a mannequin. And those eyes, they burned, locking onto us. "Inside!" I screamed, pulling the boys toward the house. Max growled low and deep, standing his ground as we scrambled back through the door. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the latch. Max barked at the door, his body pressed against it like he was trying to hold it closed. "What was that?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "What's happening?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what I'd seen. All I knew was that we couldn't go back outside. Not yet. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. They weren't heavy, deliberate footsteps like a person's. These were uneven, scraping, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. I aimed the flashlight down the hall and my heart nearly stopped. The basement door was wide open. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I locked it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Max bolted toward the open door, his barks turning feral as he disappeared down the stairs. I didn't want to follow him. Every instinct in my body screamed to grab the kids and run, but I couldn't leave him down there. "I'll be right back," I told the boys, pushing them toward the living room. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't go!" Ben cried, clinging to my arm. "I'll be okay," I lied, pulling free. Flashlight in hand, I crept toward the basement. The smell of rot hit me like a wave, making my stomach churn. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of light barely piercing the darkness. At the bottom, I froze. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like ash. The floor was damp and the air felt heavy, almost alive. Max stood in the center of the room, growling at something I couldn't see. Then I saw it. The figure from the yard was there, hunched in the corner. Its body twitched unnaturally, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. It turned its blank face toward me, and the glow of its eyes illuminated the room. And then it spoke. A single word, rasped out like it had been buried for centuries. "Leave." The word echoed in my head. Leave. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command that seemed to vibrate in my chest. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but Max's furious barking snapped me back to reality. I had to act, or none of us were getting out of this alive. "Max, come," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't budge, his focus locked on the thing in the corner. The figure began to rise, its limbs unfolding unnaturally like a spider stretching after being curled up for too long. It moved toward us with jerky, unnatural steps, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I aimed the flashlight directly at it, hoping to stop its advance, but the light seemed to barely affect it. Desperate, I grabbed the fire extinguisher I'd brought with me and sprayed a thick cloud of foam in its direction. To my surprise, it recoiled, letting out a guttural, otherworldly screech as the foam hit it. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, and the air grew colder. I grabbed Max's collar and yanked him toward the stairs. "Move, Max, now." We bolted up the steps, the thing's screeches following us. At the top, I slammed the basement door shut and shoved a heavy chair against it. The boys were huddled together on the couch, tears streaming down their faces. "What's happening?" Liam cried. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely steady. "But we're not staying to find out." The house felt like it was alive. Every creak and groan amplified as if it was reacting to what was happening in the basement. The air was thick with that horrible smell, and the faint sound of scratching began again, this time coming from the walls around us. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing the boys' hands. "Stay close to me and don't look back." The back door was still open, swinging slightly in the cold night breeze. Max ran ahead, barking furiously as if daring whatever was in the basement to follow. I guided the boys outside, the flashlight beam bouncing as we stumbled into the yard. Then, the sound of wood splintering stopped me in my tracks. I turned just in time to see the basement door fly off its hinges. The thing emerged, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. It let out a howl that didn't sound human, something primal, something wrong. We sprinted down the yard, the boys crying and Max growling as he ran beside us. The neighbor's house was still dark, and the entire street felt abandoned. I had no idea where to go, but I knew we couldn't stop. Just as we reached the street, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. The Millers had returned, and the police were with them. Relief flooded through me as I waved them down, yelling for help. The thing stopped at the edge of the yard, its glowing eyes narrowing as if it couldn't step beyond the property. It let out one last guttural growl before retreating into the shadows, disappearing back into the basement. The Millers were furious when they saw the state of their house. The boys tried to explain, but their parents didn't believe a word of it. "It's an old house," Mr. Miller said dismissively. "It creaks. It groans. That's all." I didn't argue. What was the point? But as I left, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the second-floor window, where the boys' room was, two faint, glowing eyes stared down at me. That was the last time I babysat. No amount of money could ever make me step foot in a house like that again. Sometimes late at night, I hear those same guttural growls in my dreams. And every now and then, I catch a whiff of that awful, rotting smell, like it's never really gone.